Stuck at the house? Why not make sauerkraut? Today, the importance about taking probiotics is more widely known. If you're already familiar with probiotic and living food, then skip ahead for instructions. If you aren't familiar, probiotics are basically good friendly bacterial organisms. Our body's gut microbiome, or gut flora, can have an unbalance of more bad, unfriendly bacteria, which can lead to health issues. While we will always carry some of this type of bad bacteria in ourselves, it's important to keep it in check by adding good, friendly bacteria in our gut flora, which will help maintain a balance of the bacteria that's healthy for us and can maintain overall homeostasis, or a balanced, steady state of health. Basically, it'll keep us healthy. And at a time like this, probiotics are important to keep your immune system supported. Of course, taking out foods that are unhealthy, such as processed foods that create bad bacteria in the first place, replacing them with healthy foods, and then adding in probiotic foods is ideal, because that'll truly support our gut microbiome and allow the good bacteria to flourish, and our bodies as well. Probiotics can be taken in a couple different ways, either in a supplemental form such as a capsule or in a form of fermented food. Fermented foods are a better option though because they're alive. Taking a supplement doesn't hurt, it definitely can help, but they're usually in a dried or inactive state. As for fermented living foods such as sauerkraut, contains active friendly bacteria, so there's a better chance for your gut to actually absorb that good bacteria, not to mention all the nutrients, some fiber, plus it can be cheaper if you make it yourself. It's easy to make, and most importantly, it tastes delicious. Easiest fermented food to make would have to be the tasty lacto-fermented sauerkraut. Now there's two types of ferments. One with a brine, a water-salt mixture, and a lacto-ferment which uses the same juice of the fermented vegetable with salt. No extra water needed. With a lacto-ferment, the salt ratio is also more forgiving, so it's a great first-time ferment. First, you'll need a cabbage head, preferably organic or pesticide-free, maybe even from your local farmer's market. Generally, they're cheaper and fresher than the store-bought. I've gotten cabbages as low as $1 a head at the farmer's market. And also, you can check out my video about doubling your cow fresh benefits at your local farmer's market. But any cabbage will do. This cabbage isn't the freshest. I let it sit for a little while. I didn't get around to making the video until later, but the top leaves can easily just taken off and discarded. Second, you'll need a vessel. Use glass or even ceramic, because the cabbage will become more acidic, and in a metal vessel, the metals can leach out into your ferment. You do not want that. I suggest a glass canning jar, quart size, with a wide mouth. Since the wide opening makes it easier to pack in the cabbage, you can find them just about anywhere. Some hardware stores or even craft stores carry single jars. If you buy the pack, it's kind of nice because there's tons of other uses for them, but any glass jar that you have will do as long as the lid isn't a locking lid. If your lid isn't loosely fitted, potentially it can be dangerous because of the natural occurring carbonation as it ferments. But if you stick with a mason jar with a loose fitting lid, you let the ferment burp, which I'll explain later, you should just be fine. Third is a weight. You can keep it simple and use a plastic bag filled with water. It'll conform better to a size and shape on top of your ferment, restricting airspace to lessen the chance of mold. But if you don't like using plastic, another option is using a tiny glass or ceramic bowl that you happen to have around. Doesn't need to be too heavy, just something to keep the cabbage submerged in its own brine. I personally love my glass weights, specifically made for fermenting. When I take them out, the handle makes it easier, but you don't need them. The last option, if you don't have or like any of the other options, you can just take a couple of the outer, large, thick leaves of the cabbage, fold, and stuff them to keep your cabbage submerged. Just make sure you save a couple of leaves before you start slicing. When I first started, I used all the time. It's natural and even edible. Perfect for fermenting. Fourth is sea salt. These two brands are my favorite. Today I'll be using Redmond real salt on your left, but Celtic sea salt is great too on the right. I've heard of Himalayan salt for ferments, but I've never tried it, so not exactly sure on how much to use or if it would affect a ferment differently. Supposedly fermenting can be possible with regular table iodized salt, but I definitely recommend sea salt. It's more natural, contains more minerals, so it's more nutritious without additives. I've been off of regular salt for a couple years now because I've learned it was a small but important change for my health. Plus, it tastes way better. Not too long ago, I tried a small taste. Honestly, I just spit that out. It had a chemically taste to it, felt like a burning sensation on my mouth, couldn't handle it. It may seem like an exaggeration, but take what I say with a grain of salt. Sea salt, that is. Do your own research or just try it for yourself and stick with sea salt for a while. You'll probably find that you won't want to go back. The last things you'll need is just standard stuff with food prep. Cutting board, knife, tablespoon measure, large ceramic or glass bowl to prepare your cabbage in, and if you happen to have one, a mandolin. It's much faster to process your cabbage, but it's not necessary. If you do use a mandolin slicer, be very careful. Use the guard that's provided with it, because I've used it without the guard and ended up cutting a small tip of my thumb. That's definitely not fun, pretty painful. I have a little arthritis in my leg and a subluxation, which affects my hands and hurts when I'm holding some things. Holding the wide guard made my hands feel uncomfortable and strained, but I'd rather feel that than cut off an appendage. Anyways, enough about me. Let's get to the ferment. If you need to take off a couple of the top leaves because they're a little dry or have weird spots, do so. I forgot, of course. Also, keep a couple of the decent looking leaves if you're using them for the weight. Then start cutting the stem and the inner core of the cabbage. I do this by carefully cutting the cabbage in half from top to bottom. You can quarter them if it makes it easier. Then cutting a sort of triangle, more like a V, in the middle until your cut meets up. And you could just pull out the core. The core is a lot tougher. You can ferment this part, but I've tried it before. It tends to stay pretty tough. So usually I'll just toss it, or you can do what I used to do, freeze it for later to put it in a broth if you really don't want to waste it. If you're using the old tried and true knife and board, slice away. Thinner is better because it'll fit in the vessel, but it's up to you. If you like it chunky, then slice it a bit on the thicker side. Be careful of your fingers while chopping and slicing. Human flesh isn't necessary for the recipe. If you're using a mandolin, place your cutting board underneath to catch the sliced cabbage. Empty the board or plate into the bowl every so often so your blade won't back up with the cut cabbage. So once you have it all sliced, the cabbage is patiently waiting in the bowl. You can add the magical fermenting ingredient, salt. The amount to use is hard to say, since it's mainly based on preference. Usually I do it by eye. For me, it's depending the size visually that I'll decide on how much I want to start to sprinkle on. You can even add by taste, trying some of it raw, once you let the salt mix and sit. Some go by weight ratio using scales. I don't bother with that, especially with lacto-ferments, but a good general measurement on a good sized cabbage and a 4-cup mason jar would be roughly 2 tablespoons of salt. If you don't like salty stuff or on a low salt diet, you can dial back a pinch or so. Just keep in mind to not go too low on the salt, since the flavor won't be as good as sauerkraut is known for, and the salt also keeps your ferment from spoiling. If your cabbage is smaller, you can use less salt, maybe just 1 to 1.5 tablespoons. Best way to apply the salt is to sprinkle it over. Then start tossing the cabbage in to mix some of that salt, then leaving it for maybe a minute or so. Then you can start to toss it even more, making sure the salt is fully incorporated with all the cabbage, and I'll show what I mean in just a little bit. So to kind of dramatize the change of the cabbage, I'm gonna add even more salt than usual. In hindsight, came out way too salty, but I let the camera time lapse over 5 minutes, just so you can see what actually happens in that time. Crazy, I know, pretty cool for just some cabbage and salt. But to make sauerkraut, you don't need to go that far. All you really need is the approximate 2 tablespoons of salt and the initial minute to start. As I was saying earlier, toss the cabbage into the salt, making sure the salt is mixed well. Then go into it like you're kneading dough or a deep massage technique. You don't need to light any candles or put on a Marvin Gaye album while you're doing this unless you really want to. Hey, I'm not judging. Doesn't need to be too long either, just enough for the cabbage to start wilting in your hands. Give it maybe 5 to 7 minutes and do this test. Squeeze the cabbage in one hand. If water is squeezed out, you're just about there. So keep squeezing into the bowl for another few minutes, maybe even a light pounding with your fists. You want enough of the cabbage brine to fill your jar, so be very generous with those squeezes to squeeze as much brine as you can. Salty cabbage brine, or cabbage tears, what I call it sometimes, is part necessary for the lacto-ferment. This is what happens if you keep squeezing and massaging the cabbage for much longer. This is just for the video, not necessary to go for this long. Once your cabbage has cried enough, the cabbage will now fit in the jar, and you're ready to pack it. If it doesn't, you can always dump it back out. When you pack it in, do it a handful at a time. Pack it tightly as you can by pushing the cabbage down as much as possible to make sure the whole cabbage will fit in your vessel. You can use a wood tamper, but not really needed. I own one, but my hands are small enough to fit in the wide mouth jar, and they end up hurting more sometimes if I try to use one, so I never end up using it. If your hand is too big, you can use the end of a large wooden spoon or other wooden utensil, or even a muddler if you have one. Just make sure it's wood, silicone, or even plastic. Every time you push down, brine should start to rise up. After that, put in your weight first. If you're using a small glass or ceramic weight like a jar or a bowl, or even the large cabbage leaves. Here I did the mistake of not putting the weight in before pouring in the salty cabbage water. For some reason I couldn't remember to do that, so I ended up taking the liquid out, refilling it, but it didn't help much anyways. When you put your weight, push it down as best as you can so it'll hold the cabbage down and you'll get less pieces of floating on top, which is better. Once your weight is set in place, pour in the leftover cabbage tears from your bowl into the jar. Now covering your weight with the brine is ideal, especially if you're using a cabbage leaf. But with the other weights, just make sure the cabbage is covered well with the brine. If you're using a bag, make sure to have the bag sealed well before placing it in. Also make sure you leave just a little room below the rim so your ferment won't spill as much either. Now skim any loose pieces off the surface as best as you can with your hand, wooden, or plastic utensil. Because if your cabbage isn't under its own beautiful brine, exposed pieces to the air could attract mold. Just make sure it's submerged well, and it should be safe. If you use a plastic bag, you won't have to worry about that as much because it does cover the ferment nicely. That's the upside of the bag, especially for beginners. And you could just plop it in after you poured the last of your brine in. Usually you'll use all the juice and still leave some room, but since I had so much and the cabbage wilted a lot, I didn't need to use all of it, so I could leave a lot less room from the rim and avoid the ferment from spilling over altogether. But in your case, you'll probably have just enough brine while leaving just a little room below the rim. After filling and skimming the cabbage brine, wipe down the whole jar, the rim with a clean cloth or paper towel. Secure the jar with a loose fitting lid, just barely tight enough to be closed. A finger-tight fit is best, which is twisting, or in this case a mason jar lid, a spin, then lightly tightening it with just the tips of your fingers. Just enough for the lid to not fall off if jostled. I also forgot to label the sauerkraut. That's really important. Slap a piece of tape with the date to know when you first started the ferment. Finally, the prep is done. But it's not done quite yet. There's a couple of things to remember. You'll need to store this somewhere where it's warm, but not in direct high heat or direct sunlight. Some people suggest dark places, yet I've kept it on top of my counter, especially during the summer, with no problem. However, the best place would be on the top of your fridge. It's warm, it won't get knocked over, most likely. Just don't totally forget about it. If you're a really forgetful person and your room temp is warm enough because of the weather, you can opt for the undisturbed spot on your counter away from your stove. Your sauerkraut still leaks out some brine, so place a paper towel or a plate underneath to catch the cabbage brine spilling over. I place mine on these cardboard fruit boxes just in case of a spill. Once you place it where it'll hang out and do its thing, you will need to burp it regularly every day, which is simply letting out natural occurring gases of fermentation. Every day, it sounds like a pain in the cabbage core, but it just takes a few seconds. Open the lid briefly and put the lid back on. It's that easy, just as easy as opening your emails on your phone, closing the app because you just don't want to deal with all the email listings you regret signing up for, but don't want to unsubscribe because of that one time you think you might use it. Yeah, if you do that, then you can do this for your immune system and health. Anyways, if you don't see any bubbles, tap the side lightly so the gases can be released while it's open. I'd recommend at least once a day, twice is ideal if you remember, but I've gotten away with every other day or every couple of days, but it will overflow if you do that. If you forget a day on accident, not too big of a deal, just make sure to burp it as soon as you remember. You'll also notice after the first week or week and a half, your kraut won't be quite as bubbly or active. Then you can back off on some of the everyday burping. When putting the lid back on, remember finger tight, just barely on the jar. If you tighten it too much and forget to let out the gases, that's when you have a ticking glass time bomb. It sounds scary to know that it can explode, but all I have to remember is do not tighten the lid so much. Use the finger tight method and burp it regularly. There's equipment like airlocks so you can bypass the burping step, but if it's your first ferment, don't bother buying them right away. I fermented for a couple of years already, never needed to use them, so just save your money for the time being. Now it's the burping and waiting game. Personally, I suggest wait patiently for at least 2 weeks, because by that time your sauerkraut has started to develop some flavor. You can get away maybe a week and a half if it's summertime. Warmer temperatures ferment things faster, but go for 2. Your palate will thank you for it. If you want to be a fermenting fiend, you can ferment it way longer. I've heard of people fermenting some things for 6 months, some ferments for over a year. I've never gone that long. The longest I've gone for sauerkraut is probably 2 months, just because I love the stuff and go through it pretty quickly, and can't always make enough to keep up my gut bacteria's demand. Once a couple of weeks have passed, try your sauerkraut out. condiment. Well, maybe not anything, but salads, sandwiches. I love mine on tacos. Vegan tacos, that is. I'll take some romaine leaves, stack it up with some guac, tomato, any veggies I have on hand, sprouts, and the piece of resistance, the Kraut. So good. You can even take probiotic shot of the cabbage tears when you first crack it open. To store it, just pop it in the fridge. Again, without tightening the lid too much. The cold temperature will slow the fermentation process, but it's a living food. Technically, it'll keep fermenting, just at a much slower rate, and the gases won't build up as fast. Still, keep it in the spot that won't be jostled or moved around a lot, so carbonation won't build up. If you're eating this pretty regularly and finishing it quickly, which I wouldn't doubt, then you won't really need to worry about burping. But if it's been sitting in the fridge for several days, just give it a burp, just in case. After your first classic sauerkraut, you can always venture to new flavors, adding some dry seasonings like ground pepper or caraway seeds, or even some fresh ones. I've done dill, ginger. You can throw in some veggies in like shredded carrots or a couple of cloves of garlic, sliced onions. Delicious. It's all up to your imagination and palate. So go ferment, go make some kraut.